Welcome, everyone. We're so excited to share space with you. So feel free to say hello in the chat. Let us know where you're zooming in from, what the weather's like, inner and outer, perhaps.
All the weather. Let's see. And actually, I just made it so everybody now you can use the chat bar.
Great, thank you.
Should be ungoverned.
Yes. Hi, Denise.
Mhm.
Yeah, so lovely to see you all here.
Oh, look at all the greetings come in. Hello, friends.
All over the place. Gosh, I can't keep up with all of you. Always love to see some Canadian friends.
Look, Kathy Jackson.
I know I have a Kathy Jackson too.
Toast, toast. Well, welcome. Welcome to Stubborn Praise, which has been going on since 2020 in some variation. And for those of you who haven't joined us before, Stubborn Praise is it's a conversation. If you don't see yourself, that's right. You'll only see James and I, although we will open it up for people. If you have a comment that you want to share with other people, please use the chat bar freely. And if you have a specific question, please use the Q&A. And that's how James and I will know how to find your question instead of not being able to find it as it gets buried in the chat. So if you don't know how to find the Q&A, it should be there on the lower part of your screen, of your Zoom screen. And you can ask us questions there. And usually in a program like this, what we'll do is we'll have a conversation, we'll read poems back and forth. Tonight's theme is Grateful Anyway, which we chose long ago. It's been our theme for a while, and maybe now it just feels like it fits more than ever. And then we'll open it up for questions for the last 20 minutes or 20 to 30 minutes of our time together. So we're planning to go for an hour and a half.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm just so grateful to be gathered together with all of you. It feels like it's so important to come together in community right now in general, but also in community around poetry and talking about something that might be hard for a lot of us to practice right now, gratefulness in the face of personal grief and difficulty, in the face of global grief and hardship and future thinking, worry, all of it. But that's why we're here, to try to practice together and try to share some poems that I think will help us get into that space.
And actually, I'll start with a poem
Please do.
along those lines. Let's see. Susanna says, can you raise the volume on our end? I don't think I will try to raise mine the absolute most it can go. There it is. That is the max mine will go. I don't know if you're able to raise yours anymore, James.
Possibly, yeah. I'm gonna try.
So, Susanna, could you just say in there too, if it's both of us that you can't hear so well, or if it's James or me, that would help us know then too, how to maybe help. So this is a poem that I wrote about a week ago, and it's called Reciting Poems to Each Other in a Difficult Time. And it came out of a out of exactly that, something very like what we're doing tonight, reciting poems to each other in a difficult time. It might have looked as if we stayed in our respective squares, 9 separate rooms made of pixels, but for an hour, the poems we shared leaped through the screen and into our bloodstream until all our lines were gloriously blurred, and our wounds were gently tended by the medicine of Barry's day-blind stars and Wellwood's ferocious dance of no hope, and Hopkins's shining from shook foil, and Retke's wondering which eye is I. In another time, there would have been a fire at the center. Someone would play a drum, but in this time I felt it inside me, the fire, as poems blazed to meet the great cold. I felt it inside me, the human drum that reminds me the heart beats not for itself, but for the world. For an hour, we spooned each other the honey of poetry. Alone now, I still taste it, unfiltered and raw, this astonishing sweetness on my lips, this salt of lyric communion. I still feel the warmth of that blaze, the sparks still dazzling in the dark.
Mm, lovely. Love how that just stretches out to hold it all and includes those beautiful lines from well-known poems. I was like, Dayblind Stars. Oh yeah, that's Wendell Berry, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Mm,
Yeah, there is, I think, and it always surprises me, James, how we all know a lot of the same poems
mm,
and the joy of sharing them. And
yeah.
the joy when we find another person who shares the poem that we know and love, the poem that's met us in a difficult time, and we can recite it together and thrill in each other knowing it, and how what good medicine that is, in the moment that we learned it, but also then the community of it and the communion of it, of the sharing of it, and how the deep sweetness of that, and in this way how poems become part of the fabric of a community.
Mm, yeah. Yeah, they're just woven right into it. And I know, at least for me, I have a lot of poets in my orbit. And so, in the wake of the last few weeks, a lot of us have been sharing some of the same poems, and I've been discovering new poems, but many, many poems like The Thing Is by Ellen Bass, and just these poems that I think serve as reminders to us of what we already know. The thing is to love life,
Yeah.
even when it's pushing against you to love life anyway. And yet, we get caught up in the moment and we forget and we fall asleep. And I feel like the reading and writing of poems is what reminds me and what wakes me up again. Because when I'm reading or writing a poem, and I'd say poem especially, somehow reading a novel, which I love reading novels, but it doesn't quite do it for me. Like I can get caught up in the story, but I'm still sort of thinking about what's going on in my life, what's going on in the country and the world. But somehow a poem, maybe because it asks so much of us, just total presence and attention for a short period of time, usually. Um, I just find I'm able to give myself over to that. And I just wonder if the same is true for a lot of people, maybe even those who are not usually drawn to poetry. And it's during times of uncertainty and fear that we really reach for those moments of relief that poems allow us. I don't know if this was the case for you, but it felt like for me during the pandemic, there was a hunger for poetry I have never seen before. And not just a hunger for reading it, but that was alive and well, but also a hunger for writing it, learning it, and just being immersed in it.
During the pandemic. certainly in the last 2 weeks.
Yes.
I've felt the same thing, just this kind of like, did you see, did you see there was a little Will Ferrell meme. There's this burning, there's this
Mhm.
like frame of the fire, and then there's Will Ferrell. He's like, you want a poem?
Yeah.
Meanwhile, the world's on fire. And yet, this is when we need the poems the most, right? When people are in grief, people write to me all the time, and I'm sure you too, and they say, "Do you have a poem that I can send to this person that's meeting this difficult time?" And you're right, it is in these moments of great uncertainty. I think that all of a sudden we're like, "Yes, I need a poem." I'm seeing just a handful of questions come in the Q&A, and I'll say that the title of the poem that I read was reciting poems to each other in a difficult time. And James and I are going to put every poem that we read, we'll put it into a Google Doc and share that link with everyone so that you'll all have access to all of the poems that are read tonight.
Hmm.
And James, Susanna says that your volume needs to be just a little bit louder if you
I
can.
think it's as high as I can get it. I would recommend, Susanna, if you have them headphones and just trying to keep the volume turned up on your laptop or computer. But I think it is as high as I can go. I'm a softer speaker too. I'm sorry about that.
And Julie, and anyone, all of the poems that I read, they are all, you can find everything I've written in the
Mhm.
last 11 or 12 years on my blog, which is 100fallingveils.com.
Yeah. And if you ever need a poem about something like a holiday or a season, if you just type that in the search bar in Rosemary's blog, it will just pull up all these different poems. Because I remember doing that when maybe it was when I was putting together my kindness anthology. I was looking for poems by Rosemary. I mean, there are many, many, but I was typing in like kindness, compassion, connection. I'm like, there's so many poems to choose from. So it's really nice to have like a searchable database, basically, of
Yeah.
all of your poems. I really admire that. I'm a little envious that you have that.
I can't tell you how it has saved me because in my own like folders on my computer,
uh
it's a total disaster, right? They don't, I could never find anything if it weren't for the blog and I can just type something into the search or into the tags and I'm like, oh, there it is. Yeah, I'd be doomed without the blog. If anybody, by the way, if you're thinking about starting a daily practice, I can't recommend it enough. Even if you keep it private,
Mhm.
it will organize everything for you in the most gorgeous way. Yeah, so it is
Yeah.
helpful.
Yeah, and there's something, in times of uncertainty and shakiness all around us, and when we are maybe ourselves in fear, anger, grief, whatever it is, there's something really comforting about organization and just office supplies and files that are just neatly labeled, I often turn to that. I know this might sound like a silly thing to some people, but I turn to that in times of distress because that gives me a little, I can take a breath. At least one tiny corner of my life is a little more organized. So
Just to have some little anchor. James, will you read us a poem?
I will, yeah. So I'll read this poem, and I was just talking with a friend about this poem today. I wrote this right the morning after I saw the election results. And, for me, that was very distressing, but I want to honor that not everyone may be in that space, but, that's the space that I was in. And so I needed a poem, and I didn't know what that was until I wrote this. And this was the poem, this was the practice that I needed to hear. And it probably came about because a lot of folks were sharing, stuff from Mr. Rogers, from Fred Rogers. And so this comes from a quote from him, and he said that when he would get really frightened, especially by the news, his mother would say, just look for the helpers, look for the people who are helping, because you're always going to find some helpers out in the world. And I have found that to be true. So this is Look for the Helpers with a very big nod to Mr. Rogers. Today I will look for the helpers, the woman pouring sunflower seeds from an orange bag into the feeder, and a chickadee having eaten its fill, lifting off so another can feast there. Someone holding open the fogged over door of the coffee shop for a stranger who smiles and says thank you in spite of the news. I will watch workers dressed in neon vests with shovels and buckets filling potholes across the city, the asphalt steaming as they spread it over the street, then tamp it down, repairing what they can.
Yeah. Wow. So just this little, I mean, a few things I noticed, James, about this poem. One is I remember when you wrote it and sent it out, and I
Mm,
remember the feeling I had, right? Maybe we could say this, that there are multiple ways to respond to a poem, and one of them is just how does it make you feel? Right? I
mm,
remember this kind of um, ease, ease in my
mm,
body reading it. But I also think about this, how there's an invitation sometimes when it's difficult to meet something head on. Emily Dickinson said to meet it slant, right?
mm,
And in a way, this poem is meeting it slant. It's to look for the helpers is a way to see what partly what what's happening in the world that gives me hope about the world, that gives me peace about the world. Um, so that we see that it's not all everything hasn't been destroyed, right? That
mm,
everything isn't wrong. It's not all wrong. Look at these things that are right. I mean, just see how beautiful, even just to how daily, how
mm,
practical the things are that you said too. To somebody opening a door, somebody, fixing a street, and to put our attention there, not to say I'm ignoring this other thing, but
mhm,
to open the lens wide enough that we can see that there is also this, here they are, the helpers. Here they are.
mhm. Yeah. Yeah, other things are included. It's not a matter even of turning away completely from what's happening to us or into the world. It's a way of, like you said, widening the lens so that the perspective is more true because there are people still helping. There are people doing their job, doing good in the world. And, the other thing about this is I think it's tempting to say, oh, like I'm perceiving that this terrible thing has happened or things are really wrong and so I need to be the helper, but I'm in pain and I'm in grief, and so I may not be able to become the helper quite yet, but I can look out and find the other people who are in that space or just simply who have a job to do and who are doing their job,
Yeah.
and I think that can be really comforting. Like, we don't always have to be saving the world in this active way. We can be witnesses and watchers of the people who are repairing what they can, who are giving what they can, even if some days that just doesn't feel like, enough to really be grateful for, to just let it be also what we see.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I heard the most incredible thing about that just last week. It was Wednesday, was World Kindness Day. And it
Mm,
was an event hosted by the Global Compassion Coalition. And one of the speakers had done these studies around kindness, in which they showed that the studies found that not only does kindness affect the person who's receiving the kindness,
mm,
not only does it affect the person who's offering the kindness, but just witnessing the kindness
mm.
has a profound effect, which I
Yeah.
thought, Of course it, of course. I mean, that seems actually kind of obvious in a way, right? But in a way, your poem also invites it. Like
Mhm.
you notice, oh, look, here's the person who's opening the door. Here's the small act of kindness. It's not you.
That's
You don't
right.
have to do anything. And you're not receiving anything either, except just knowing, oh, here it is. Here's an act of kindness. And just to see it has a profound effect on, and then they also went into the science of the nervous system and all that it might affect. And then they actually went beyond that into some, at any rate, it was pretty glorious, the effects of
Yeah.
kindness. But just what you're saying is you don't have to necessarily do it to soften the self or to,
Mm.
to come into a state of more calm. Um, how does that then, just being grateful for, oh, look, kindness exists, just seeing
Mm.
it happen. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that has that same effect on you.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, in some ways it does seem like, oh, that should be obvious. That seems like a simple thing, but it's another one of those things that we easily forget and that we need to be reminded of, or at least I know I do pretty regularly, that just witnessing kindness. And I think Dr. Keltner, who's written about awe, he calls it when you're watching people be kind to each other or take care of each other, he calls it sort of being in awe of the moral beauty of other people, so that there's this way in which we can even bring that sense of wonder and awe that we think is reserved for these like amazing, huge things. It's like, no, actually, it could be just, the person opening the door of the coffee shop or the woman, joking with her little baby in the cart at the grocery store. It's like this too is awe. This too is moral beauty. And I think there's also a fourth way or another way in which we're affected by those acts of kindness, connection, and compassion, because I believe that there's entanglement theory, right? Like something happens to a particle here that's been connected to another particle. They're like far, far away now. Something happens to this particle, the other particle feels it. You
Right.
know, there's a measurable effect. Well, I've touched your life, you've touched my life. Something happens to you on some level, cellular perhaps, not even always perceptible. It happens to me, especially if we're really closely connected. I feel like someone shows me kindness, they're showing you kindness. So there's this whole web, this way in which we're connected. And I think that's why this is a time of fear and uncertainty. And to some degree, we're all feeling that and living that, no matter where you are politically, because a lot of people are in distress and pain and fear right now. So it wouldn't matter if I had no idea what American politics was or was taking in a bit of the news, I would still be affected by that. And so I think it helps to be aware that we're all living in this same, we're kind of simmering in this soup together right now, and to just honor that and to just really notice that in some of these small ways that we're talking about.
Yeah. You said that very beautifully. That was in large part what this other fellow was saying too. He didn't call it entanglement theory. He had some
Mm.
other ways of talking about it, but very much so this whole idea of how, yes, the fear radiates, and so does kindness, so does compassion, right? So does
Yeah.
tenderness.
Mm.
All right, here's a poem about this, and how I suppose how beginning here, right? Just noticing what's here and how to be so gentle with what's here, and how is that a starting place? Um, the poem is called With Astonishing Tenderness. When in the middle of the night, you wake with the certainty you have done it all wrong. When you wake and see clearly all the places you failed in that moment when the dreams will not return, this is the chance for your most gentle voice, the one you reserve for those you love most, to say to you quietly, Oh, sweetheart, this is not yet the end of the story. Sleep will not come. But somehow, in that wide awake moment, there is peace. The kind that does not need everything to be right before it arrives. The kind that comes from not fighting what is real. The peace that rises in the dark on its sure dark wings and flies true with no moon, no stars.
Mm. Yeah, that's one of my favorites from The Unfolding. Thank you for reading that.
Mhm.
Yeah. Boy, those moments of waking up convinced that you've been doing it all wrong. Those are
Right? I should
so
have been
common.
happy. I should have helped different. I shouldn't have done that.
Mhm,
And I think just that little message to the self of, oh, this isn't the end of the story. It
mhm,
doesn't end here, right? And it, in a way, and a part of the reason I thought of this was because you were invoking uncertainty. And in a way, I
mm,
feel like this poem helped me see that the uncertainty isn't a bad thing in this, in
mm,
that I don't know where this story goes next, right? I might think I know where this story goes next,
mm,
but I really don't. And the fact that it isn't ended, that it isn't a complete thing, that the story is ongoing, the relief of that to know that this point that feels so desperate, that feels so awful, that feels so absolutely unfixable, isn't the end. This isn't the end.
mm.
Oh, oh, sweetheart, this isn't the end of the story, right? And that, boy, I remember just how it just gave me so much. I was so happy. Where is it, this line? In that wide awake moment, there is peace, the kind that does not need everything to be right
Mhm.
before it arrives, right?
Yeah.
And how I sometimes have maybe this fantasy that everything's going to be right and then there will be peace, as
Mhm,
opposed to everything can look like a well, some things can be a total disaster. The total disasters can be happening and peace can exist in that moment. The peace that
mhm.
comes when we're in that floating of not knowing and open to any possibility of what could go right. Like in any given moment that anything is possible, that everything is possible.
Mm.
And to the softening that happens, maybe that's where the peace comes from.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's maybe the astonishing part of the tenderness, that the tenderness is such an antidote to um, all that other stuff, all the rigidity of like, but it has to be right. It has to be this way in order for me to relax. I have to know that this was okay, or, that this is going to happen. And uncertainty is not a bad thing. It's just a hard thing. And it is just a thing that we have to live with. And I've realized in listening to this poem, it has made me realize what I've been feeling lately, which is that I've been relying a lot on outer circumstances to make me feel okay inside. And that is natural and a very human impulse, but it's not very useful, because how often are things going to be, for long periods of time, how often are things going to feel safe and okay outside here? That's just not. And I think maybe a lot of us are feeling like, wow, it's really not okay out here all of a sudden. And like realizing that it can still be okay inside, even if we're not there yet. I think your poem offers us that possibility of the astonishing tenderness that intercedes, even if it's just like, I will take 2 minutes of tenderness, self forgiveness, self compassion in the middle of the night over, believing that all is lost and that I'm just a terrible person. I should have done better and known better. Um, yeah, and it's not the end of the story. I feel like that's I was writing this poem about milkweed the other day.
I
And
love that poem.
and I don't know if that line stayed in there or not. I can't remember now. But I did have that idea of like the plant knows this is not the end of the story.
Yeah.
Like this desiccated looking thing that has just spilled its seeds, that's not the end of the story. The plant will go on. Okay,
Mhm.
I will read that poem. Just
Yeah, yeah,
I'm
send that poem.
obviously quoting it. Um, yeah, and
Yeah.
this was one that my husband helped me with too. So he'll be happy that I'm reading
Oh, good.
it. So this is everything that is divided. Everything that is divided, split, must eventually reveal the softness at its center, like milkweed pods that seem dead at the edge of winter, the fluff of a seed still clinging, like hope, no, like faith, to the stem of a plant that knows it will go on. This is not the end of the story. Even if those days of monarchs and blossoms filled with nectar and caterpillars feasting on leaves are over for now, the plant has learned to see the possibility in each small thing we offer to the world.
Yeah, right. That's so
Mm.
beautifully said. Being on the edge of winter as it is, that is something lovely to be able to talk to you in real time about the poem I just
Oh,
read that you just
yeah.
wrote. Wait, so how did Brad help you with it?
Well, I just wasn't sure if it was complete. It was one of those that happened really fast for me. And, it's not like I always doubt that, but it happened really fast. Nothing much was changing every time I rewrote it. And so I really asked him to reread it. And, he's good at taking out things that don't belong, but he actually ended up um, kind of saying, it needs to stretch out a little bit more in the middle when I say, even if those days of monarchs and blossoms filled with nectar, caterpillars feasting on leaves, like we need to know what is lost.
Yeah.
Too, we have to honor that and then bring us back to that milkweed that looks dead, but is trusting that these seeds it sends out, these are not, this is not the end where it is right now and how it looks right now. Something more is to come. And what a wild, whatever we call it, hope, faith. I corrected myself in the poem. Feels like
That was a
faith.
glorious moment in the poem, by the way. That was a glorious moment where just to see that little struggle with what is the right word? What is the right
Yeah.
word? Yeah, I love that that was in there.
Yeah. And I still don't know if that's the right word. I want to say trust too, that it's what a wild trust in the ways of the world to just open yourself so completely as the natural world so often does. I mean, milkweed is this common thing, we're just so used to looking past it. But there were that little seed that was left clinging to the pod. I just thought, man, there's something there. And it feels like a little promise for me too. Every time I start to harden into a certain feeling, like, well, what if this happens,
Right.
under the next administration? Or what if this happens with, someone that I thought was stealing money from my bank account? It's all fine, didn't really happen. But like I was hardening into these stories. And if we could just say, what if this is not the end of the story? What if this is not the end of the story? And somehow I feel like poems are these really flexible containers that, like I was saying about your first poem that you read, they just stretch open. They can hold so much. And then they can kind of shrink down again and give us this little slice, this little sliver of life that kind of shows it all to us at once so that we know there's a whole spectrum of possibility here, that it's not just this one thing. And if I feel this way now, it doesn't mean that I'm going to feel this way, even 2 minutes from now.
Okay, and the other thing that I really like about it, and you bring in the spectrum, and I feel like this is an important part of this poem, right? Is that I feel like it shows up just how natural, how normal the emptying is, right? It is a
Mm.
normal and, in fact, important, essential part of the life of this milkweed to be emptied, right?
Yes.
As much as it is to be this beautiful, growing, luscious thing. Both of them equally important. And I feel like I had a conversation with one of my students today in which he was talking about how his daughter is in this place where she thinks nothing should be going wrong, that for things to go wrong is a problem, and that she thinks that the point of being alive is to be in a state of not having problems.
Mm.
And he can't be the one to tell her actually that there is this spectrum, but it's just a I'm so interested in it right now myself, just in how do we relate to the full spectrum of what it is to be alive? How do we notice, how I've been having all kinds of pain things, body things, just kind of a relentless one thing after
Mm.
another in terms of things happening with my body. And my gorgeous life coach, Rebecca Mullen, said, Rosemary, could you treat your body like it's a poem?
Mm.
And I thought, okay, what would that mean? Like I got very excited. I was like, really? Because and what an invitation, James, to think of my body as a poem, my relationship to my body as a poem, and to think, okay, so when I'm stuck with a poem, if anybody here, I'm sure there's bajillions of you who've like been in classes with me, and I'm like, being stuck is not a problem. That's just
Mm.
part of writing a poem. That's just a part of it, right? So I'm like, okay, being in pain is actually not a problem. It is a part of having a body. This is an interesting thing, right? Because it feels like a problem. I can't walk. This feels like a problem. I mean, it is a problem. And it's a part of having a body
Mm.
to have things happen so that you can't walk. That is a normal thing it's a totally normal body experience. So just thinking about opening the lens that wide, right? Being that accepting. I feel like this has been mind blowing for me around because I feel like our bodies, this is where rubber really hits the road often,
Mm.
right? It's not okay. That's not okay. Well, we don't like it, but is it a normal thing for a body? Is it
Mm.
like that milkweed pod, right? The milkweed pod gets dried up and it lets everything go. That is an essential part of its lifestyle. That's an essential part of not lifestyle, but what it is to be a milkweed, right?
Mm.
And an essential part of what it is to be human is to have our bodies break down because bodies break down. That is part of our humanity.
Mm.
We might not like it.
Right. Yeah, and yet,
Okay,
there,
go ahead. And yeah.
no, I'm not going to contradict you. I'm just saying, like, even I'm saying and yet because it's like, oh, this is a hard thing to accept. But there's like, I wait for the moment that the milkweed pods split open. It's a beautiful thing to me. And
Of
when
course.
when we are in pain, there's a splitting open. I think there's a greater receptivity to empathy when we're in grief. I just wide open, painfully open, but wide open.
Yeah. All right. So on that note,
Yeah.
this is the poem I wrote last night, and I'm thinking about it now because of this conversation about being wide open to the full spectrum of it. Um, I'm not sure. I guess maybe I should preface this. I'm guessing that a lot of the people who are here know that my son chose to take his life 3 years ago. And so this is a poem that's talking about that. My daughter and I just went back to my mother's home where it happened in Georgia. And her first time back, my daughter's first time back, I've gone back many times, but this is, I suppose, the thrust of this poem is, I suppose, that touching on that full spectrum of experience, visiting the place where my son died. Please, I tell myself, don't take this lightly. Don't walk into this room as if it's just another room. Come with reverence, please. I say to myself, all of myselves, please don't stride across this wooden floor as if it isn't the last place your son brought the world into his lungs, the last place he loved and ached and wept. So I sit and breathe until I feel it rise in my chest. How sacred it is, this place. I sit here until I feel my attention split. I notice the urge to leave. I choose again to stay. And the choice baptizes me. Please, I say to myself, please slow to the pace of stone. Nothing to do but be here. And the crying comes and goes and comes again and goes. I close my eyes and let the shadows grow. Then open my eyes and look beyond the window to the sky, the cliffs, the lake. Please, I tell myself, do not refuse to see it is beautiful. What is the part of me that dies? And what is the part that rises, slow and new, to walk again into the world?
Thank you so much for reading that one.
I think in this conversation about that full spectrumness, right?
Mm,
And the milkweed and how it empties. It's not wrong for it to empty, right? It isn't wrong for it to hurt. It isn't wrong
mhm,
to be devastated. Nor is it wrong to still fall in love with the world. So
mhm,
if I flip those and I say them positively, it's right to be devastated and it's right to see the beauty
mhm,
in the same freaking moment.
mhm,
And it is what it is to be alive. It's totally what it is to be alive. And then and even then that longing, that that like the little self-talk that I had to do in the poem, that I had to do in real life, like, don't pretend it's not hard. Don't pretend this
mhm,
isn't a difficult place. Don't act like it's not hard to be here. It is
mhm,
hard to be here. Of course it's hard to be here. Don't How often do we do this? What's the word for it? Spiritual bypass, or like,
mhm,
oh, it's okay. Oh, I'm fine. No, actually,
mhm,
it's not fine. Don't pretend it's fine, sweetheart. Let it hurt, and let it be beautiful.
mhm. Well, I think that's a more radically honest way of approaching heartache and just everyday life, really, is to say, like, let it be difficult and harrowing and let it be beautiful at the same time. I think there are probably some people who might have trouble with that, that view, that, like, how can it possibly be beautiful? This horrible thing happened to you, to your son, to your family. This horrible thing happened to me. How can I see the beauty too? And I just think, if we're not hardening into the story of this is what happened and this is the only thing that's true, then many things can be true in the very same moment, just like you're saying. but that's hard for some of us to accept. And sometimes I'm not there, honestly. It's like, I just want to be in my pain. And, that's all there is. But because I'm trying to be fully alive and have this writing practice that sort of forces me to be more alive, whether I want to or not, I am noticing the beauty, the awe, the moral beauty of other people. And, you're able to say that that's one of the things when I read it this morning that really struck me. Um, because just go with me here. So I was getting a massage yesterday, and this amazing massage therapist, the music's playing, like it's the most beautiful room. There's like beaded curtain, plants everywhere, softness. I'm like, oh, I need to be in more sacred spaces like this. And then instantly, this voice, as I'm lying on the table, this voice came in my head. Every place can be sacred like this. And that's what you're showing us, that even this room where this happened can be sacred because it's where your boy loved and ached and took the world into his lungs. I love that echo of taking the world into his lungs and then you walking into the world with him, for him at the end. So, you know, it's like the conditions don't have to be right, whatever that means, right, for something to feel sacred or for us to bring reverence to our lives or to the world.
Mhm. That's so beautiful. I love that you had that. Of course, it reminds me of the Wendell Berry quote, there are no sacred places, there are only, places that are sacred and have been desecrated.
Mm,
And I feel like I got it wrong just a little bit, but it's almost what he says. And then we go back to what you were saying earlier, right? Like, how do we bring that into ourselves so that when we it isn't the external conditions, but the internal conditions that allow for that sacredness to be in place.
mm,
And I think it was that little prayer I had for myself. Can you come with reverence? If we can
yes.
come with reverence. And I've been obsessed with this idea lately, James, about the little mantra in my head is not the what, but the how. Not the what,
Mm,
but the how. So it's, or in this case, not the
mm,
where, but the how, right? Not the where is it sacred, but how do I meet this place? And if I meet this place with reverence, then every place is sacred.
mm,
When that's our inner, when we bring the sacredness with us, what isn't sacred? That willingness to find the sacred.
mm. I love the idea of bringing it with us because how is it ever gone? It's just a story, I think, that we often tell ourselves that like, oh, I'm not feeling connected to the sacred, so it must not be with me right now. But I think when I sit down to read or write a poem, the sacredness is there again. It's right in the room with me. And the poem is helping me to name that and see that for myself. Um, there was something else. There were many other things that I was going to say. Um, well, maybe they'll come back.
We'll read a
So,
poem in the meantime.
yeah, I'll read a poem. And, this one is about loss and letting go. Let's see here. Of course, I just have to find the right place for it because whenever I get with Rosemerry, I never read what I think I'm going to read.
All the plans go out the window. That's what happens.
Oh gosh. Yeah, they do. Okay. This is the only prayer. Because there was nothing else to do as usual, and the news frightened me. I took a walk on my favorite trail in the woods, And because the snow began to melt as soon as it fell, everything was wet, the lichen a bright lime green on the bark of each fallen tree, the leaves beneath my feet deliciously soft as they squelched and sank back into the arms of the earth that shaped them. I picked up one of the limp, gold-toned beech leaves, pressed it to my chest, then left my despair on a mossy trunk and
Mm.
said the only prayer that matters. I'm here. I'm here. I'm here.
Mm. Wow. So I hear this, just that gorgeous presence, right?
Mm,
The way that even to say I'm here brings us even deeper into I'm here.
mhm,
And how the world, the beauty of the world, our admiration for the world, for a single leaf, just it's that act of noticing and appreciating. Here we are, grateful anyway, right?
mm,
That act of saying thank you to that, just for this beauty of being available to it is a doorway again and again and again into presence, right?
mm.
Is the chance to realize, oh, the gift of being here.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I think too, like we can be here and these things, like I was struck in the last poem that you read when you said the crying comes, which is so different than saying I was crying or I am crying. The crying comes. It's this visitor, and so despair is a visitor. It doesn't mean it's hard. It's not hard to welcome. It's not hard to make space for this difficult visitor, but it is a visitor. And sometimes when we can remember the sacredness that's with us and around us, I think we get to leave it behind, even if it's just briefly. You can say, I'm going to leave you here. I'm going to let you rest here for now. I think that's harder to do with grief, but maybe a particular wave of grief we get to let pass through and lay down. I'm in my mind, like turning over a card, letting it all take over, laying the card face down, and not having control, of course, over the next wave of grief or the next wave of despair or the joy that we really wanted to hold on to. Um, but I don't know. I'm kind of obsessed with this idea of being out in the world and that there are these places where we encounter the presence and where like, yes, I want to believe and hold on to the fact that every place is sacred. And yet, there are some places, and they're very unlikely often, that feel more sacred when I'm more in touch with the sacred than other places. And those are the places where maybe even laying down the despair or the pain um, is not as accurate as saying it becomes less relevant in the face of the sacredness that you encounter in that space.
Right, 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 right. I mean, I was so struck by that part where you lay it down.
Mhm.
What do we lay down? What do we pick up? But then shifting that, this is the God, this is the beauty of a frame, right? Oh,
Mm,
is it laying it down, or is it just saying, you know, it's less relevant?
yeah.
And just noticing the difference between those two, one in which it's a real thing and it has a real weight to it, and the other in which it just do we turn there or do we turn here? And just noticing just the little bit of language and how language, to use your milkweed pod, how language can harden it. The language
Mm.
itself
Yes.
hardens our experience. So we say,
Mhm.
well, I'm carrying it. Well, suddenly we are. Now we're carrying it. Now it has a real weight. And we really believe that. And I mean, the power of the way that we phrase it
Mm.
can become so profound, you know.
Mhm. Yeah. And I was going to say what we think we're laying down, because I'm thinking about that poem now, and of course I'm very pleased with where it is. But if I were writing the poem in this moment, I might not say something about leaving despair behind or laying that behind. I would be laying down my need for things to be other than they are, or my need to control or force something to
Yeah,
be other than it is. I wouldn't be arguing with reality, in other words.
yeah, right. Yeah, this is maybe one of my favorite, like I love this about poetry, right? Is that it seems to invite all the parts of us at once. The part of us that is wanting to argue with reality, and the part of us that is
Yes.
totally on board with reality, and they can both show up in the same poem and inhabit it in at the same time. And you know how the parts of ourselves, just meeting all these different parts of ourselves, and how they, you know, the part of me that resists, the part of me that's on board, the part of me that says, you know, this is a problem, and the part of me is like, this is just life, and letting them coexist, hang out together in the same poem, which helps them hang out together in the same human, right?
In the same body poem.
This human body poem. What if the body were a poem?
I love that. Yeah. Well, I love that your coach asked you that, because I was thinking as you were reading, and perhaps feeling this in my own work too, that the voice is so generous and gentle. The voice of kind of self-talk within the poem, and yet that helps it become so in life, but it doesn't always translate, that oftentimes my internal voice can be unkind, or doesn't always fall in line with that kinder voice that shows up in the poem that obviously is much wiser. um, and so I was just thinking, like, yeah, to see the body, or whatever part is in pain, as the poem, and to bring that gentle, generous, wise voice to that. I think it's doing what you're just talking about now, which is including all of it, showing up as we are on the page, just as we are in life, and understanding actually that makes it more true and more compelling and relatable to other people when we are showing up as this mixed bag. I have so many poems that I start in a place of resistance and obviously just not being in a very good mood. Like my poem, Winter Morning, that, like, I can't say thank you. I just can't say thank you. And then by the end of the poem, I'm saying thank you. So the poem is working on us at using that voice. I think even without our consciousness always being aware of it, the poem is trying to pull us toward presence. Like, no, look, there are things to be grateful for. There are sacred spaces everywhere.
Yeah, yeah. I want to be clear about that too. I totally agree with you. I know that this is true for me too. I think there are many ways to write a poem.
Hmm.
I think that the particular kind of poem that you're talking about is a poem that's really interested in a full spectrum, right? Because I think
Hmm.
there can be a poem that's interested in, all right, I'm going to make a big statement here. We can argue about this if you want. Other people can argue with us about this. I'm gonna say this, and we're just gonna try this on.
Hmm.
The style that you're writing about, I feel like this is a poem that's invested in the soul, which is to say,
Hmm.
the part of the self that's engaged in mystery, uncertainty, unknowing, mythology, the big human experience, versus the self, which is interested in its story and its story and winning and being
Mm,
okay and being great.
mm,
The ego, right? So if we make a distinction then between writing a poem from the self versus writing a poem from the soul, or the what part, what is the voice that's directing, or what is that voice that we're hearing? Because I think you're right. I think in a poem that's invested in what's here, maybe bringing this word mindfulness, this full spectrum that we've been talking about again and again and again tonight, versus a poem that might be more like a rant, like this is why I'm right, and this is why I'm right, and this is why I'm right. And maybe the
mm,
difference being a poem that's interested in paradox, that's interested in opposition and how oppositions need each other. In fact, how, you know, how opposition is an essential part of our humanity, not just our humanity, of the universe,
mm,
versus this is what I want. Like it's when in my own language, then for when I'm writing, it's when I'm in the way. It's like my story, the way I want it, the way I
mm,
want it, the way I want it, versus opening up to what else is here, what else is here, what else is here as a
mm.
process.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I mean, I haven't thought of it that way. And I think there there might be other ways of framing it too that are really interesting. Like, we were talking earlier about that kind of hardening into the story, into the self. And so, one poem in particular might be caught up in the story and in the rant, or another particular poem of hardening might be like, well, I'm just going to play with language and just use language as my material to sort of give a snapshot of my mind at this moment. But it's not softening into other possibilities. I think it's really hard for me to talk about without bringing too much language that again does harden and just name, like, well, there's this kind of poem and this kind of poem and this kind of poem, because really I don't care what form it takes. I'm just interested in poems that I can use to live.
Right?
you
The
know,
useful
the,
poems, those ones.
right, right. And what I can use to live probably will be different from other people, but I'm guessing, in the cross section here in the middle, like there's going to be some crossover between the poems that bring me alive and that I can really use, and the poems that others. But I think you're absolutely right that it does have to do with this encounter with soul, spirit, whatever we're willing to call that mystery. Um, that is most compelling to me, because there's no real way to be definitive when you're talking about the soul, or when your poem itself is sort of engaged in this push pull, to me, very interesting struggle between the self that wants to be safe, that wants to know what's going to happen, and the soul, which says, so what? Who cares? Like, life is bigger than that. And it's this constant struggle, this constant push pull. And maybe there are just openings on this side and openings on this side, but it's all a mix.
And it's all a mix. It's all a
Yeah.
mix. The hardening, the softening. I really love that language, James. I really love that. I love what Emily Style just wrote, by the way, in the chat bar. What does the poem want? From the self hardening, from the soul softening. And I do feel like this, yeah, right? That feels really like an essential thing to be curious about when we're writing. Am I hardening? Am I softening?
Mm.
Yeah. Friends, I see it's time to ask you to ask us questions. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. We may not see them in the chat bar. So if you happen to have already asked a question in the chat bar and we didn't touch it, ask it again, but in the Q&A part. And it'd be lovely to have just a little conversation with anything that's coming up for you as you've been listening to James and I tonight. James and me, as you've been listening to James and me tonight. Hello. Hello, preposition.
Grammar police. Um, yeah, and we will gather up the poems that we've read, as much as we can remember them all, and we will send you a little Google Doc link with those poems. So don't worry if you didn't hear the name or you are wanting to know if you can get that poem. We will share those. Um, do you want to read another poem? I have another poem that I
Yeah,
want
I'll read one
to.
because nobody's got a question yet. Or do they? I don't. Oh, maybe they do. I just hadn't scrolled down. At some point, could you explain? Oh, would love to hear more about both of your revision and editing process. At some point, could we explain what stubborn praise means? And
Okay.
we didn't do it at the beginning this time. Uh, and then there's a beautiful thank you. All right. So, uh, and just so you know, yes, the talk is available as a recording. That will totally be part of it. You'll receive that. Who is quoted about the kindness research? I will send you a link to that too. And so I'll get it to James so that he can get that to you. All right. So we'll each read a poem and then maybe we'll talk about revision and stubborn praise. So
Mm.
on the note, on everything we've been talking about just now, about the softening and how do we do that, this poem is called Inviting Spaciousness. And by the way, I wrote it on election day when it was the poem that I needed.
Mm.
It was the poem I needed. Inviting Spaciousness. Today, when the heart is a small, tight knot, I do not try to untangle it. I don't tug on the strings in a desperate attempt to unravel it. I don't even wonder at how it got so snarled. Instead, I imagine cradling it, cupping it with my hands like something precious, something wounded, a bird with a broken wing. I cradle my heart like the frightened thing it is. I imagine all the other frightened hearts and imagine them all being held in love. And I breathe. I breathe and feel how the breathing invites a spaciousness. I breathe and let myself be moved by the breathing as I open and soften,
Mm.
open and soften. And nothing changes, and everything changes. The heart, still a knot, remembers. It knows how to love. It knows it is not alone.
Mm. Mm. Open
By the
and
way, I had
soften.
there it was, there's the softening. And also, I just want to tell you, like, my little joy in this poem was the last two words. It is not alone.
Mm.
And it had that little KNOT not. It's anyway, there you got it. James, how about you?
Yes, I have many knots, but not in this poem. So this one is, I guess this one, I felt a strong desire to read this because of our discussion of sacred spaces everywhere. And so this one is called Little Altars Everywhere. This is from Unlocking the Heart. There are little altars everywhere in the world, places where you can lay down your suffering for a while. Hollowed out oak trunk by the forest trail, where you leave acorns and pine cones and worries you've gathered on a cushion of moss, whose patience softens everything. Or the bench at the busy intersection, where streams of people crossing the street parted around you, and you fell in love with each of them, the men in suits, babies strapped in strollers, and left your fear crumpled there like a useless receipt. Or the shelf where you keep the box of your mother's ashes next to an electric candle that flickers day and night. How you give your grief to the yellow glow of that false flame over and over, knowing that even the plainest of light can be enough sometimes to hold your pain.
Even the plainest of light can be enough to
Mm.
hold your pain. Yeah. Boy, that beautiful idea of sufficiency.
Mm.
Thank you. By the way, I've read that poem. I used it as a writing invitation in a
Mm.
class I led not too long ago,
Thank you.
within the last month or so. And just where do we find altars? Where can we find these little altars? What do they look like? Or what, are they, literal places or these metaphoric places like you suggest? And what's
Yes.
possible at an altar? How in this way, right? How beautiful to go back to our conversation about sacred spaces, right? There's that reverence coming in. If you're looking for an altar, you'll find one anywhere you are.
Mm. Oh, that's good. Yeah.
You bring it with you, right? The
Mm.
willingness for there to be an altar.
Yeah. I love the concept. There used to be these folding altars that people would carry with them so that they could, pray and hold services wherever they were. And I just think the book, right? The book is the folding altar.
Right, the book is a
The
folding.
notebook, the book, I don't know.
Oh, beautiful. Let's see. So going to some of these questions. Oh, no, we do have quite a few. What role can poets play in growing new understanding as an activist action during these times? Yeah. And by the way, I want to say that I just put out a call for people to respond um, about how do you turn to creativity in difficult times. If anybody has a response to that, you can email me at emergingformpod@gmail.com or go to our Facebook, the Emerging Form Facebook page. But I would love to know other people's answers to this. But what do you think, James? What role can poets play in growing a new understanding as an activist action during these times?
Well, I think that poets can really complicate the relationship to what's right or wrong and to those ideas of right and wrong. And just to go back to that word we were using, soften, I think
Mm,
that poets can help us soften to each other in divisive times. They can help us soften to even the people that maybe we need to fight against or that we, you know, the people we need to oppose for whatever reason. That softening to them and seeing them as human is only going to help us. I feel like poets can help us dwell in that, very gray area between the black and white, which is where all of life is really happening. um, so they can really call our attention. I'm saying they, like it's some other group. We can really call attention to that during these times.
Pronouns again. Yeah, that I don't know that I could answer that any more beautifully, James, right? I think that the gift of poetry is how it embraces paradox
Mm.
and to bring in the full spectrum, right? How do we do that? Through softening, through reverence, through I think there's a how do we feel it all, right? To have a charge and to notice, what is the impulse to serve and to notice in service to what? Is it in
Mm.
service to our own agenda? Or
Mm.
is it in service to this opening, to this unfolding, to this expanding, to this greater humanity? Um, Not that there isn't also a need to I go back to that poem that I read about being there in the room, the poem I wrote last night, don't don't pretend it's not a big deal. Don't
Mm.
pretend it's not a big deal. And don't pretend it isn't beautiful what's happening all around you. And now at the same time, And I think the poets can bring this, right? That kind of expansive vision, that spaciousness that I said, inviting spaciousness in the last poem, right? How do we bring spaciousness to this moment, that flexibility, that softening, just like you said, where everything is possible.
Mm. Yeah.
Um, and you want to touch what stubborn praise means?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we really thought of this during the pandemic, and I think the idea, well, first of all, we both have poems called Stubborn Praise, and we're not sure who came first, but not that it matters. But we both have poems, and the idea is really to just, even when things are really difficult, when the world seems like a hard place to be grateful in or for, to say, well, I'm going to be stubborn. I'm going to praise it anyway. I'm going to find the beautiful in the awful, in the harrowing, in the really hard times, because that's just honest, the
Because that,
praise. Yeah.
yeah. Do you know, it occurs to me for the first time, this is kind of funny, that we have stubborn praise and that the whole theme of my new book is praise.
Mm,
And and the 4 chapters of the new book are all words that I've made up for praise, which honestly, they are kind of stubborn praise, but like Pangloria, which is
mhm,
noticing that there's opportunities for praise everywhere, even the places we'd rather not look, or some union, which is some is to sing and union is union. And some union meaning, the praise that comes when we realize that there's, that all of us are moving together, and
mm,
that even the people who maybe we would rather not be connected, the people who we think of as other, it takes all of us, right? We're all so deeply connected. There's this entanglement that you were talking about earlier, right? And how complex it is and how true it is when we realize, oh, we only progress together. This is the only way
mm,
we do it. Not we
right.
get ahead and you go beyond. It never is going to work that way. It's always lockstep, right? With
Mm,
even the people we think, but they're wrong. But that's wrong. Yeah.
mm,
Let's see. Another question was about revision and editing.
mm. I think the more I practice, the more I just see it as a natural process. It doesn't even, I don't even like to call it editing. It just sounds so professional. And I feel like the process for me is so intuitive at this point. So I'm not sitting down with a red pen. Really, I just usually, I think we've talked about this a little bit before, but I rewrite things until the extra language just kind of has fallen out and is just not there, and I do that usually by hand. And then sometimes I'll do that by typing and retyping and retyping and retyping until it's more embodied. And and I've taken it as far as I can take it. And then usually I'll let it sit for some time. That could be a day or two, and that could be a year or two or more, and just see where it goes from there. And I'm not precious, and I think Rosemary has really helped me with this. I'm not precious about like, I can't share this until it's absolutely perfect and it's been accepted by 5 different literary magazines. And, I used to be such a perfectionist. So it can be shared and then it can change and it can morph and it can still be edited and revised. So that's just my view.
The danger of that, of course, is that there's a poem in the new book. It's called Self-Compassion. And
Mm,
it was funny because when the book came out, I've gotten a bunch, two. I've had 2 people saying, "Oh, that's not the ending it had before," and they'd gotten kind of attached to the old
mm,
ending. And
yeah.
and I say, you can keep it. Like, go ahead. You can have that ending. Keep that ending, but I did explain the reasons why maybe I changed the ending the way I did to be more embodied, by the way. And I love that you use that word. And I feel like in revision, I have a handful of questions that really help me as I'm revising, um, which include how is the poem moving? Like literally from beginning to end, how does it move? does it go from outer to inner, or from angry to
Mm,
grateful, or from, the natural world to the inner world, or, anyway, does the poem move?
mhm,
How does the poem move? Another question I love to ask myself is, what's at stake? Does this poem matter? Is there any part of or more crassly, like, so what?
mhm,
And I'm always kind of curious about, where's the tension? There has to be tension. This touches on what we were talking about earlier, right? Real life has tension. And if the
mhm,
poem doesn't have tension, if it's all bah, rah, 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 then there has to be a moment of softness. Or if it's all there has to be a moment of prickly, to balance it out, because that's what real life is like. And
right.
so just noticing, where is the tension in this poem?
Mm,
Yeah. So those are questions that I ask myself, but I think you're so right. Like, it's such a gentle, playful process at this point, where I'm just so curious of, where am I in the way?
yeah.
Do I have an agenda in this poem? Have I been true? That's the biggest question.
Mhm,
Is it true? Is it true?
right.
Did it just seem like the right thing to say, or is that really it?
Mm,
Because I know for a fact that if you can write something true, now you have a poem worth sharing.
that's right. Yeah.
Now you have a poem worth writing.
Mhm.
Cares? Who cares?
That's, yeah, that's the biggest stake of all, is telling the truth, I think, especially nowadays, and, just telling our own personal truth. Yeah.
Um, the blog, thank you for asking. My blog you can find at 100fallingveils.com. And the link to Emerging Form, if you just send an email to emergingformpod@gmail.com. Um, well, sweet man, I think we probably have time for one more poem each.
Sure.
Do you want to, how about I share one? Um, well, actually, maybe you will, because somebody asked for one in particular, and I'm going to see if I can find it.
Mm. Yeah, let me see here. I will read. This seems like a good one for these times. So this is another one from Unlocking the Heart. And again, we'll share these poems with you afterwards. And this one is called After Burnout. You finally decide to do no more than is necessary, relishing each new gulp of air drawn into your lungs, when out of the flavorless mush of days, even weeks without sun, it happens again. Life calls you back. With a hint of chocolate in the cup of coffee taken alone at the table, or the needles of coneflower seeds sticking to your fingertips as you spread them around in autumn earth. How all living things want to go on, attaching themselves to whatever body or breath of wind will carry them home. Now stop in the driveway and listen as amber gold leaves, one by one, break off with a simple snap of stem from branch, that sound just shy of silence, saying to you, it's time to release all the relentless reaching for the light. Rest is not death, though it may feel like it at first.
Rest is not death, though it may feel like it at
Mm,
first. What a perfect poem to read right now, right? When it's darkening, when it is a time of natural rest. There it is again. It's not a problem, right? The things we
mm.
think of as problems. Isn't it supposed to be overflowing? Isn't it supposed to be abundant? Isn't it supposed to be? And in fact, here we are, invited into this time of rest,
Mm, which is not the end of the story, right?
which is not the end of the story. To bring back the refrain. Yeah, yeah, beautiful. I love that you shared that one, especially because it's a darkness, and it's the time of this year, and the poem that Lonnie requested was in times of great darkness, which is also now. And um, I was thinking, by the way, one of the things that I thought maybe we would even have talked about tonight, which here we are at the end, but this idea of how do we be grateful for what's here, right? And how
Mm,
I have come to be so deeply grateful for darkness. I think in part for what your poem is touching on, what is possible in the darkness that isn't possible at other times, this time of deep rest. We're just not grateful for it when we want something else, right? But
mm,
to know that how do we find gratefulness for the rest or for the imagination or the dream time or whispers or whatever it is that comes in the dark, regeneration and um, so Bonnie asked if I would please read this poem in times of great darkness and say something about it. I actually wrote this poem for the fabulous Paula Lepp
mm,
and beautiful friend of mine. And yeah, let's face it, we really long to take care of each other. We long to do beautiful things for each other. I think as much as we long for each other to thrive on their own, I think we also long to take care of them. And I've had to really continue to learn how to, as my teacher says, give people the gift of themselves,
mm,
to know that their darkness is their darkness and that it's an essential part of their own growth. And maybe we want to fix it as if darkness is a problem. But um, this is about that longing to help another person. In times of great darkness, I want to do for you what the sun does for me. Coax you to come outside, to breathe in the golden air. I want to warm you and enter you, fill you with brilliance, make your muscles melt, make your mind shh. I want to prepare for you luminous paths that span across deep space. Thaw any part of you that feels frozen. Find any cracks and slip shine into them. I want to intensify your shadow so that you might better know your own shape. I want to encourage you to open wider, wider. I want to teach you to write your own name in light.
mm, mm. There's that opening wider and wider again. Mm.
Open the lens, feel it all, right? Like how difficult is it to want to intensify someone else's shadow? Really? Ah! And yet, and help them write their own name in light, right? How to be the one who's able to hold our friends, our loved ones, even our enemies,
Mm.
right? In the because we're only going to get there together. Right? So
Right.
how do we invite that darkness and that light for each other? Say, I'm here to help you meet all of that.
And doing that for others, I think, does it for us too, because we need the darkness that we have in our lives, and we need the light too. We can't have one without the other. And I remember being at this celebration in Ojai, California years ago, and being in this circle of people, and we were going around and saying what we were grateful for. And, of course, people were talking about their homes and their families. And this little girl, probably 10 or 11 years old, got up and she said, I am grateful for the darkness that lets us rest. And I just have never forgotten that moment. I mean, what a wise young woman to just put that out there. Um, obviously she had very, very wise, smart parents, probably too, but the darkness that lets us rest. Maybe we all need that to some degree, knowing that the light will also be there, that the light will also come, and that the sacredness follows us too.
I can't imagine a better place to close tonight with grateful anyway, with I'm grateful for the darkness that lets us rest as we move into this darkest time of the year, literally, maybe metaphorically. I'm grateful for the darkness. Yeah, thank you, James.
Yeah, thanks, Rosemary. Thanks to all of you.
Everyone, thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Take good care.